At the very core of our legal framework lies this idea that when the government takes action, it has to be fair.
Mm.
And that, brings us to a concept that's been making headlines and raising a lot of questions lately. Due process.
Absolutely. Due process.
Yeah.
It's that fundamental shield, really, protecting individuals from the raw power of the state.
Mm-hmm.
And recently, the conversation has really intensified around who exactly is entitled to these protections, especially, when we're talking about individuals who aren't U.S. citizens.
Right. So for this deep dive, we've gathered a really interesting set of materials to dig into this.
Okay.
We're looking at analysis from factcheck.org, reporting from CBS News and PBS NewsHour,
Good sources.
insights from the International Rescue Committee, the IRC, a transcript of a segment from Live Now W from FFox on YouTube, and even a discussion that unfolded on Reddit's Source Interest Forum.
Wow, quite a mix. So our goal here is to really unpack what due process entails, right?
Exactly.
Whether it's a safeguard for everyone present in the United States and to understand the context surrounding the current debates, particularly as they relate to immigration.
We want to try and provide a clear understanding of what's, frankly, a pretty complex area.
It really is.
Okay, so let's get right to it. When we talk about due process, what are the essential elements, like the basics?
Well, the basis for this is in the 5th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. The 5th Amendment clearly states that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law.
Okay, person.
Exactly. And the 14th Amendment extends the same requirement to the states. What's really crucial there is the word person, not citizen.
So this protection isn't limited to just citizens. That's the key takeaway there.
That's the fundamental point. And Amy Grenier of the American Immigration Lawyers Association provides a really practical way to think about this.
How so?
She emphasizes that at its heart, due process means having the chance to know what you're accused of.
Right.
And the opportunity to argue against those accusations. Essentially, if the government is looking to remove someone, that individual needs to understand why and have a fair shot at presenting their case against that removal.
That sounds like a pretty fundamental principle. Seems straightforward almost.
It does, doesn't it? But then the question that keeps coming up is, does this apply universally to everyone in the U.S., regardless of their immigration status?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, it seems.
And the prevailing view among legal experts is a firm yes. Both Grenier and Kathleen Bush-Joseph from the Migration Policy Institute underscored that these constitutional safeguards apply to anyone physically within the borders of the United States.
Anyone physically present.
Yes. And Grenier raises a compelling point. If due process only applied to citizens or those with lawful status, how could someone even begin to prove their citizenship or lawful status if they weren't first given an opportunity to be heard?
Huh. That's a really interesting way to frame it, like a procedural catch-22 otherwise.
Exactly. But I know there are different procedures in place depending on how someone enters the country, right? It's not always the same process.
That's correct. Bush-Joseph points out that the legal pathways can vary quite a bit.
Okay.
For example, someone who has overstayed a visa and has, established roots in the U.S., they typically go through formal immigration court proceedings before any deportation order.
Makes sense. More established ties.
Right. However, someone apprehended shortly after crossing the border without authorization, well, they might be subject to what's known as expedited removal.
Expedited removal.
Okay.
What does that involve?
It's a process where an immigration officer can basically issue a removal order without a hearing before an immigration judge.
Wow, no judge.
Unless the person expresses a credible fear of persecution and seeks asylum, then it triggers a different process.
I see. And I recall reading that the expedited removal process was expanded quite a bit under the Trump administration.
Yes, significantly. It initially generally applied to those caught, I think, within 100 miles of the border within 14 days of entry.
Right. Relatively limited scope initially.
But the expansion extended this to anyone who had crossed the border unlawfully within the preceding 2 years, regardless of where in the country they were apprehended.
2 years. That's a huge difference. So what were the arguments against that expansion, legally speaking?
Well, one of the central legal arguments is the contention that it violates the fundamental right to a hearing before a neutral decision maker.
The cornerstone of due process, really.
Exactly. Critics argue that this expanded process increases the risk of erroneous deportations, without adequate safeguards. People getting sent back who shouldn't be.
Okay, this is all still quite abstract. To really understand the human impact, can we delve into a specific case?
Yeah, let's do that. The name Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia came up a lot in our research. What makes his situation particularly relevant here?
Abrego Garcia's case is a really compelling and, frankly, quite disturbing illustration of the complexities and potential pitfalls when due process concerns intersect with immigration enforcement.
Okay, tell us about him.
So he fled El Salvador back in 2012. He was facing severe gang violence there.
Right.
Came to the U.S., lived with his U.S. citizen brother in Maryland. Then, in 2019, he was taken into custody by ICE.
And the initial move was to deport him straight away.
Pretty much. The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, initiated deportation proceedings under Title VIII, basically saying he was in the U.S. without legal admission.
Okay.
In response, Abrego Garcia applied for asylum based on a well-founded fear of persecution if he were returned to El Salvador.
Now, this is where claims of gang affiliation entered the picture, correct? That complicated things.
Hugely. What was the basis for those claims? It seems pretty central to his case.
Yes. So during the legal argument surrounding his detention while his asylum case was pending, DHS alleged that Abrego Garcia was affiliated with the MS-13 gang.
Okay, MS-13. And their evidence.
They presented two main pieces of what they considered evidence. First, his attire at the time of his arrest, apparently a Chicago Bulls hat and a hoodie with certain images that officers interpreted as indicative of Hispanic gang culture.
His clothes. Seriously.
That was part of it. And second, a statement from an unnamed informant who claimed Abrego Garcia belonged to a specific MS-13 clique, supposedly based in New York.
New York. But he was in Maryland.
Right, a state his legal team maintains he has absolutely no connection to. And importantly, Abrego Garcia and his wife have consistently, vehemently denied any gang involvement at all.
So what happened at the bond hearing where this DHS evidence was presented? Did the judge buy it?
Well, an immigration judge determined that for the limited purpose of deciding whether to grant him bond.
Okay, it's just for the bond decision.
The DHS's contention of gang membership appears to be trustworthy. But, and this is really crucial, the standard of proof for denying bond is lower than what would be required to formally establish gang membership in, say, his asylum case.
So it wasn't a ruling that he was actually a gang member.
Absolutely not. It was purely about the risk assessment for releasing him on bond. But former Attorney General Pam Bondi later mischaracterized these findings pretty significantly.
How so?
She stated publicly that two courts had ruled he was an MS-13 member, which, based on the records, simply wasn't accurate.
Wow, that's misleading. So what happened with his actual asylum claim, then? A different judge handled that?
Yes. A different immigration judge presided over that aspect. Now, interestingly, this judge also didn't make a final determination on the gang affiliation allegations either.
Okay.
But they reviewed all the evidence related to his asylum claim and found Abrego Garcia's testimony to be credible and consistent with his application.
So they believed his story about fearing return.
They did. However, his asylum application itself was ultimately denied.
Why, if they found him credible?
Because he had missed the one-year deadline for filing after entering the U.S. It's a strict rule.
The filing deadline. Okay.
But despite denying asylum per se, the judge granted him something called withholding of removal.
Withholding of removal. Okay, can you clarify what that entails? Is it like asylum?
It's similar, but distinct. Withholding of removal is a form of protection granted to individuals who can demonstrate a clear probability of persecution if returned to their specific home country.
So it stops deportation to that country.
Exactly. It prevents the U.S. government from deporting them to El Salvador, in his case. It allows them to remain in the U.S. and get work authorization.
But it's not permanent residency.
No, crucially, it doesn't provide a pathway to permanent residency or citizenship. And technically, the government could still try to deport the person to a different third country if one would accept them, though that's often difficult.
I see. And in Abrego Garcia's situation, the judge specifically found he had suffered past persecution and that the gang threat was still real for his family back home.
Correct. So he was permitted to stay and work. Seems like, okay, despite the complexities, the legal process worked.
Yeah.
He got protection.
You'd think so, but then he was subsequently deported, wasn't he, this March?
Yes, this is where the situation takes a really troubling turn and raises serious due process concerns.
What happened?
On March 12th of this year, 2025, ICE officers arrested Abrego Garcia again, apparently without presenting a warrant.
No warrant, just arrested him.
According to reports, yes. They just stated that his status had changed, which made no sense given the withholding order.
Okay, and then?
He was moved between detention facilities, and then, incredibly fast, just 3 days later, on March 15th, He was put on a plane and deported to El Salvador.
3 days. With no hearing, no chance to see a judge.
None whatsoever, according to the court findings.
That sounds completely contrary to the idea of due process, especially given he had that protection order.
It was. And U.S. District Court Judge Paula Sinas later issued a really powerful ruling on this.
What did she say?
She stated flatly that his detention and removal were wholly lawless because there were simply no legal grounds whatsoever for this action. Zero basis.
Wholly lawless. Strong words from a federal judge.
Very. And it's worth noting that even Vice President J.D. Vance inaccurately claimed in public statements that Abrego Garcia had received the due process he was entitled to before this March deportation.
But that's not right, based on what you're saying. He had due process in the first case back in 2019.
Correct. Legal experts are clear. While he had due process in his 2019 proceedings, which resulted in the withholding of removal, he was completely denied any process before this sudden 2025 deportation.
So the courts intervened after he was already deported. What could they even do then?
They did. The case went up quickly, and the Supreme Court ultimately upheld Judge Sinas' order. They instructed the Trump administration to facilitate Abrego Garcia's release in El Salvador and ensure his case is handled back here as if this improper deportation had never occurred.
Facilitate his release, so bring him back.
Essentially, yes. They directed the district court to clarify the specifics of the order to ensure his return, while also adding some language acknowledging, the executive branch's role in foreign affairs. It wasn't a simple, go get him now command, but the intent was clear.
But I remember hearing there was resistance from the administration about actually bringing him back. What was their argument?
Yeah, the administration argued that once Abrego Garcia was physically in El Salvador, his detention became a matter for the Salvadoran government, not the U.S. Basically, he's their problem now.
Even though the U.S. unlawfully sent him there.
That was their position. And adding another really dangerous layer of complexity, Salvadoran President Bukele publicly stated that he would not release Abrego Garcia, even calling him a terrorist.
Oh, wow. So that leaves Abrego Garcia in an incredibly difficult, potentially life-threatening situation, stuck between governments.
It absolutely does. And this whole case, it really throws into sharp relief some of the broader rhetoric and actions we've seen from the Trump administration concerning due process and immigration enforcement.
Like what other examples tie into this?
Well, for instance, former border czar Tom Homan suggested that just being suspected of gang affiliation should somehow diminish or even eliminate an individual's due process rights.
Eliminate due process based on suspicion? That's a radical idea.
He even invoked the rarely used Alien Enemies Act in that context.
The Alien Enemies Act. I've heard that mentioned. What is that exactly, and why bring it up now?
It's a very old law. It goes way back to 1798. Historically, it was intended to grant the executive branch broad powers over non-citizens from hostile nations during times of declared war or actual invasion.
Okay, wartime powers, but we're not technically at war.
Exactly. Its peacetime application is extremely limited and legally controversial.
Yeah.
But Stephen Miller, a former senior advisor, he even posted on X, formerly Twitter, that those who illegally invaded our country are entitled only to deportation, just straight up deportation, seemingly dismissing any notion of due process protections beforehand.
Wow, so just bypass the courts entirely.
That seems to be the sentiment. And the administration has actually utilized the Alien Enemies Act to deport suspected Venezuelan gang members without what we would typically consider standard due process. Right. This was mentioned in both the Reddit discussion we looked at and the IRC article.
They actually used the 1798 law to deport Venezuelans. To where?
Yes, reportedly over 200 Venezuelans were deported under the authority of this act. Correct. And they were sent to a prison in El Salvador.
To El Salvador, not Venezuela.
Correct. And what's particularly concerning, according to the reports, is the lack of individual hearings or any real presentation of evidence in these cases before deportation.
So just rounded up and shipped out based on suspicion, potentially using this old law.
That appears to be what happened.
Yeah.
The IRC notes that a large majority, maybe 75% of these individuals, reportedly had no prior criminal record in the U.S.
75%. No criminal record.
Yeah, and they cite examples like a makeup artist who was seeking asylum who apparently got swept up in these deportations.
That's deeply troubling. But again, did the court step in to address this use of the Alien Enemies Act?
They did. The Supreme Court intervened, requiring the government to at least allow individuals the opportunity to defend themselves in court before being expelled under the Alien Enemies Act. So some check was put in place.
Okay, so they can't just deport someone under the AEA without any court process now?
Correct. But as we've seen with the Abrego Garcia case, The administration's interpretation and implementation of these court rulings can still be, let's say, a major point of contention.
Right. And it's important to keep stressing that Vice President Vance's assertion that Abrego Garcia did receive due process before his March deportation was simply incorrect, factually.
Absolutely incorrect, based on Judge Sheena's findings.
It's deeply concerning to see such fundamental legal principles seemingly being questioned or even disregarded at high levels.
And President Trump himself made some rather striking statements recently regarding due process, didn't he, in those interviews?
He did, yeah, that caught my eye too. In interviews with NBC News, which were covered by CBS News, PBS NewsHour, and Live Now W from FFox.
What did he say?
When directly asked whether everyone on U.S. soil is entitled to due process, and then followed up with whether he, as president, is obligated to uphold the Constitution, President Trump stated, quote, "I don't know."
I don't know. To whether everyone gets due process or if he has to uphold the Constitution.
He said, "I don't know," to the due process question specifically. He then indicated that he follows the guidance of his lawyers and the Supreme Court.
Okay.
But he also, in that same context, referred to Abrego Garcia specifically as seeming like a very dangerous, very bad person.
Bringing up Abrego Garcia again. On what basis?
He referenced past allegations of domestic violence from Abrego Garcia's wife, which is complex because he also acknowledged in the same breath that his wife now supports his return and denies the gang allegations.
Right. She denies the gang claims and wants him back. It's complicated.
Very. And there's even been discussion, apparently, about the Department of Justice potentially going back to the Supreme Court to seek further clarification on its order regarding Abrego Garcia's return. Like, what exactly do you want us to do?
So it's still very much an ongoing situation with potentially huge implications.
Definitely. It really sounds like the very bedrock of our legal framework is being actively debated and challenged right now.
Yeah. What were some of the key reactions and concerns that emerged from that Reddit discussion on source interest regarding these issues? Did people pick up on this?
Oh, absolutely. The Reddit discussion on source interest largely reflected significant worry, maybe even alarm, about the apparent denial of due process in some of these immigration cases. People were very focused on the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, seeing it as a potentially dangerous overreach, and just the broader implications for the rule of law generally.
So concerns about setting precedents.
Exactly. Users expressed fears about a potential erosion of fundamental constitutional rights, not just for non-citizens, but potentially down the line for everyone. The risk of governmental overreach if individuals can be detained and deported without what's considered proper due process, based largely on suspicion or, flimsy evidence.
Was there any pushback or was it mostly concern?
There was definitely some debate, as you'd expect on source interest, but a strong theme was that upholding legal processes and due process shouldn't be misconstrued as being soft on crime or somehow sympathizing with criminals.
Right. It's about the process itself.
Precisely. Many argued it's just a crucial element for maintaining the integrity and fairness of the legal system for everyone, regardless of who the individual is.
The International Rescue Committee, the IRC, also outlined some of the wider consequences of limiting due process for non-citizens. What were their main points?
The IRC highlighted several critical issues. They emphasized that policies aimed at speeding up deportations like expedited removal and anything that restricts access to legal counsel directly undermines the possibility of fair hearings.
Less time, less help equals less fair.
Essentially, yes. They also pointed to a specific executive order that suggested unscrupulous behavior by immigration lawyers.
Really? Attacking the lawyers?
Yeah, and the IRC fears this kind of rhetoric could have a chilling effect, discouraging attorneys from even taking on complex immigration cases, which further weakens due process protections for vulnerable people.
If you can't get a lawyer, your chances aren't good.
Exactly, and the IRC stressed that prioritizing speed over thoroughness in immigration proceedings inevitably increases the likelihood of mistaken deportations, people being sent back to danger wrongly.
And they mentioned Abrego Garcia.
They specifically cited the Abrego Garcia case as a stark, tragic example of precisely this risk, someone with protection being unlawfully removed.
What else does the IRC do in this space?
Well, they detailed their own ongoing work providing direct legal services to immigrants, helping them navigate this complex system. And they advocate for legislative fixes, too, like the Fair Day in Court for Kids Act and the SHIELD Act, which are proposed laws aimed at strengthening due process safeguards within the immigration system itself.
Okay. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it seems pretty clear that while due process is meant to be this fundamental right intended to protect everyone within the U.S., regardless of their immigration status.
Mm-hmm.
Its actual application, in the context of immigration enforcement, is facing some pretty significant challenges right now.
That seems like an understatement, yeah.
Recent policy shifts, the use of things like the Alien Enemies Act, and even the public statements of high-ranking officials are raising serious questions about basic fairness and the foundational principles of our legal system.
Absolutely. And the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia just serves as such a stark and frankly troubling illustration of these complex issues playing out in real life.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It really underscores that inherent tension, doesn't it, between, legitimate national security concerns on one hand and the constitutional rights that are supposed to apply to all individuals within our borders on the other.
Finding that balance, or maybe recognizing that sometimes there isn't an easy balance, is the core issue.
Yeah. And this leaves us with a crucial question, really, for you, the listener, to consider. What are the long-term ramifications for a society when its commitment to due process, a cornerstone, we keep saying, of its legal framework, appears to falter, or at least be heavily debated, especially when it comes to vulnerable populations?
That's a heavy question.
It is. How does this perceived erosion or questioning of due process impact our collective understanding and perception of justice and fairness, both here at home and how the U.S. is viewed on the international stage?
It's something we all probably need to think about more.
It's a truly fundamental right to reflect upon, and we really encourage you to explore the resources we've discussed today to deepen your own understanding of this very complex, very important issue.